You walk through the cavernous mine. Your torch is burning low. According to the map, you're nearly at the treasure, but as you begin to daydream of the riches you're about to acquire, your leg brushes against something, and you hear a snap. You only have a single moment to contemplate your mistake before the entire roof caves in above you. Miraculously, somewhere beneath the rubble, you're alive. You try to scream, but you can only cough. You try to move, but dozens of boulders pin you down. Through the crack between the stones, you see a light creep closer, and a dozen tiny eyes appear, peering through the darkness towards you. You hear giggling and scheming, while the creatures decide whether to leave you there to starve, or shift some rocks so they can start to devour you alive. Guten Tag und welcome to From Mythos to Monsters. Too much? Sorry, I'm just getting ready for the trip to Germany that we're about to take. Before we get going with today's episode, however, I'm going to remind you to please subscribe to my channel and check out my Patreon, because the more support I get in those places, the better this podcast will get. And whether free or paid, if you're already supporting me in any way, then thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now, let me whisk you away to medieval Germany. Imagine for a moment you've just bought yourself a new timber house in town, and pretty soon you start noticing strange occurrences happening, like things getting inexplicably tidied away or knocked over when nobody is around. Chances are you have a kobold. The term kobold has been around since at least the 12th century, but didn't come to be associated with the household spirits until some centuries later. There are a lot of different theories about how the kobold first came to be. Some believe the word may relate to the Greek sprite Kobales, which served the god Dionysus and commonly played pranks. Or it might have stemmed from ancient pagan beliefs which survived despite the Christianization of Germany. There's also a good chance that kobolds share roots with other beasties in myths such as brownies, boggarts, gnomes and dwarfs, to name just a few. In fact, the word kobold itself may even be related to the word goblin, which was originally not a specific creature like we understand it today, but a descriptor that could be used for various different sprites and fairies. As is the case with many myths, the idea of the kobold seems to have stemmed from a large variety of different folktales before becoming more distinctly defined as Germanic cultures gradually became more individual and developed. By the time of the medieval era, kobolds had become a much more tangible concept. Most of them were house spirits bound to a specific building, usually a home, but sometimes shops and other businesses as well. Some other types of kobold were said to dwell aboard ships, while others stayed in caves or mines. In fact, it was thanks to miners' legends about kobolds that the metal cobalt was actually named. Tales of kobolds were widespread across Germany, with subspecies appearing all across the country, each possessing different traits and stories. These regions had their own names for their own kobolds, but I'm not going to list them all, partly because there's far too many, but also because some of the words are extremely German sounding and I'm too scared to try and pronounce them. However, I should shout out one specific type, the Drac of northeastern Germany, a kobold with a dragon name that was said to manifest as a fiery being. You'll see why I mentioned this one later on. In terms of their personalities, kobolds could either act helpfully or mischievously. Examples of helpful acts included doing chores around the kitchen or stable, while their pranks included knocking over tools or pushing people while they were crouched over. You might draw the line at getting knocked on your arse by a kobold, but if you wanted to punish them for being little shits, you'd have to proceed with caution. You see, kobolds could be angry little bastards, and if you wanted to stay in their good books, you'd have to keep them happy by doing things like leaving out bread and milk for them, and God help you if the cat got to it first. No, seriously, I found not one but two different stories about kobolds who are being tormented by kitchen boys and retaliated by, brace yourself, killing them, chopping them up, and cooking them. These guys did not fuck around. The most common explanation for how kobolds were able to do so much around the house without being seen is that they could turn invisible, leading to them often being compared to ideas of the poltergeist, another German concept. This might also be why some people believed that kobolds were actually the spirits of deceased children. In their true forms, kobolds were generally thought to be the size of a small child, although they were sometimes depicted as smaller than this as well. They typically look like children, but they could also be portrayed as old bearded men. Although before you shoo away any little bearded men running about your house, please make sure it's not just one of your grandparents. In some stories, kobolds could also take the forms of ordinary household objects like candles or domestic animals like cats. Since medieval times, kobolds have endured as a beloved staple of German folk myth. However, they began to change very drastically in pop culture during the late 21st century as they were slowly adapted into the emerging fantasy genre. See, the biggest problem the kobold has always faced while transitioning from myth into fantasy is its similarity to the fantastical idea of the goblin. Like I mentioned earlier, as we saw with trolls, while goblins started out as a word used to describe various mythological creatures, they eventually became ones in their own right. In early fantasy, both goblins and kobolds played similar roles in stories. They shared an archetypal role as small, evil minions who could be both comical and devious. It's undeniable, however, that the kobold's popularity has been totally overshadowed by the goblin. I mean, they've become so culturally iconic that I think even the most ancient members of my own family could probably describe one. Although, mind you, maybe they just think they all look like David Bowie. The only fantasy franchise where kobolds have remained a long-term popular staple is Dungeons & Dragons, but they've had to sacrifice a great deal along the way to stay relevant. In D&D's original edition, Gary Gygax himself fully admitted that aside from being small, his kobolds in the game took no inspiration from the Germanic myth. As an extra middle finger to mythology, they also look like dogs. Don't ask me to explain why, because I can't. It feels like every episode so far, Gary has done something insane that nobody understands. As a side note, kobolds being depicted like anthropomorphic dogs in D&D has had interesting repercussions across the globe. When Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released in the late 70s, kobolds were described as having a dog-like snout and mouth. However, in the Japanese version of the game, this was translated as "they are dog persons." As a result, ever since then, Japan has portrayed kobolds as being dog people. You'll still commonly see this in fantasy mangas and anime series to this day. I didn't know this until I was watching the anime adaptation of Delicious in Dungeon last year, which featured an adorable kobold adventurer named Kuro, who resembles a Shiba Inu. Originally in D&D, kobolds were there to fill a niche as weak enemies for low-level adventurers, specifically parties that were too shit to even take on goblins. Yet by stripping kobolds of all the myth behind them, that's all they really were in D&D, slightly weaker goblins who looked like dogs. A popular idea later emerged that they enjoyed setting traps and also came to be associated with living underground. I'll give the game designers credit and say this was probably at least in part associated with the folklore of kobolds who lived in caves and mines, but maybe even that's generous. Yet all of this wasn't enough to really make D&D's kobold that interesting, so they continued to only have limited popularity in the game. That changed, however, when 3rd edition came around, and oh boy, I'm going to say this now, if you're a fan of what kobolds have become in modern fantasy, you're probably not going to like my takes from here on out. Don't turn off the podcast, so that would be really bad for viewer retention. Just, I don't know, plug your ears or something. For 3rd edition, D&D's creative team was tasked with reimagining less popular monsters in ways that would help them stand out. We saw that with the Kelpie last episode, which finally became a horse in 3rd edition rather than just some weird humanoid plant. So, for their reimagining in 3rd edition, the kobold was reinterpreted as a small reptilian creature. It still had some dog-like features, but it was now instead said to be a species that served evil godlike dragons such as Tiamat. Maybe this was somewhat related to the Greek idea of the Kobalas, the sprites who served the god Dionysus, since this is a similar dynamic. There's also a chance that redesign could have been informed by the Drak, the subspecies of kobold I mentioned earlier, which is associated with dragons and fire. Once again though, I feel like I'm grasping at straws here and giving D&D more credit than it probably deserves. Well, for better or worse, D&D's kobold had undergone a drastic change that rendered it completely unrecognisable from its namesake, but it only then finally began gaining popularity as a monster. Now, I should point out, I don't necessarily hate the idea of D&D's kobold. I mean, it does somewhat manage to distinguish them from goblins, but I can't help but feel like they become too weird and goofy to achieve this. At the very least, their name should have been changed somewhat down the line. If its connection to Germanic myth had been severed entirely, it might have had the freedom to become something more interesting. Well, Conan, you ask, if I hate the direction D&D went so much, how would I write a kobold character? Well, first of all, watch your tone, alright? Because I don't appreciate you interrogating me on my own podcast. Now, if you calm down a bit, I'll tell you. Kobolds I would write would go back to being house spirits. They would at times be helpful and lovable, and at other points be pesky and irritating. Sometimes if you punished them or moved things around in a way they didn't like, they might even be a little scary. But this wouldn't come from a place of evil, rather a genuine care and sense of ownership over the space that they are tied to. Because in many ways the kobold is the house they live in. Furniture may come and go, people may move in and out, but the kobold will remain, watching over their home until the foundations crumble and nothing is left. Alright, let's snuff out the candle in this episode and leave the kobold to do its chores. Thank you for listening. I don't think there's been an episode yet with so much disparity between the myth and the monster, but I'd love to know your thoughts on kobolds and whether you like the direction they've taken in fantasy. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. If you're interested in my content, check out my Patreon, and auf Wiedersehen.